Beneath the golden vaults of the Imperial Palace, where light itself seems bowed by the weight of history, there exists a silence so absolute that it swallows the tread of armoured boots and the susurrus of prayer. In that silence, a line of figures stands unmoving, not statues, though they could be mistaken for such. Their armour is a muted gold, unpolished and unadorned, its surface bearing the faint etching of 10,000 years of vigilance. Behind their expressionless helms lie eyes that have witnessed empires rise and fall, but never their own order break. They are the Adeptus Praetorian, the throne's silent watchers, guardians not of a man, but of an idea, the permanence of the Imperium itself. It is said that before the Unification Wars ended, before the legions Astartes were loosed upon the stars, the Emperor looked upon Terra and saw not a world unified, but a fortress incomplete. His armies could crush nations, his science could rebuild the human form, but such victories would be ashes if there were no one to defend the heart once he had left to conquer the galaxy. Thus was born a compact between sovereign and shadow, a cadre forged to stand at his side not for years, but for as long as the throne itself endured. They would have no laurels, no banners, no place in the annals of imperial conquest. They would be the keystone no one sees, the unseen line that holds the arch of empire aloft. Legends differ on their precise origin. Some say they were culled from the finest regiments of the Unification era's proto-imperial army, warriors whose loyalty had been tested in the crucible of Terra's last wars. Others claim they were the remnants of ancient dynastic guards, whose oaths to vanished kings were broken and reforged in the Emperor's name. There are darker whispers still, that the first Praetorians were the failures of the custodian gene-forging process, too flawed to join the 10,000, yet too potent to be cast aside. Whatever the truth, all versions agree on one point. They were bound to the Emperor by an oath so absolute it left no room for life beyond service. They were not Astartes. They lacked the gene-forged transhuman perfection of the legions, yet in their presence even a space marine might pause. For while the Astartes were made to wage war, the Praetorians were made to end it before it began. Their remit was not the taking of worlds, but the prevention of their loss, the shielding of Terra from all that might touch it, whether by sword, by word, or by thought. This made them dangerous not only to enemies beyond the palace walls, but to any within them whose loyalty might waver. From their earliest days, their presence on the battlefield was rare. They were not dispatched to reinforce campaigns or bolster sieges except when Terra's survival was at stake. Instead, they served in the shadow of diplomacy, their heavy boots echoing through marble halls and steel corridors, an unspoken warning to those who thought imperial politics could be played like the petty games of old knight. A planetary governor considering defiance might awaken one morning to find a Praetorian standing silently in the audience chamber, unmoving until the oath of fealty was sworn anew. An envoy of the Emperor might travel to the edge of human space accompanied by a single gold-armoured figure whose mere presence silenced dissent and quelled the boldest schemes of rebellion. Their most sacred duty, however, was to the throne itself, not only as bodyguards to the Emperor, but as custodians of his person, his words, and his will. This was a duty so consuming that those who bore it began to shed the trappings of their former lives entirely. Names were set aside, for to be remembered was to have a self beyond the oath. In time, their ranks came to consist of men and women who were known only by their watch number, their voice rarely heard, their face never seen outside the sanctum of their brothers-in-arms. The Unification Wars were brutal beyond reckoning, yet even in those blood-soaked years, the Praetorians were not defined by slaughter. They were defined by restraint. They would enter a battlefield not as the first wave, but as the last, when the enemy's defeat was assured, yet the danger to the Emperor's person or his designs was not. In the siege of the basalt citadel of Girok, they stood upon the ramparts before the imperial flag was raised, ensuring no hidden foe could reach the Emperor's command tent. In the negotiation halls of the Carrack Concord, they flanked the Emperor in silent ranks as he spoke to lords who had ruled since before the age of strife, their stillness more potent than any shouted threat. What set them apart was not their weaponry, though they bore arms of exquisite craftsmanship, power blades with edges honed at the molecular level, shields layered with gravitic counterfields, and sidearms capable of piercing the void plating of a starship corridor. It was their refusal to bend in any circumstance that made them the Emperor's chosen wardens. This inflexibility was both their strength and the first seed of their potential downfall. For in the Imperium, where survival often demands compromise, those who will not bend are sometimes those who must be broken. When the Emperor at last set forth to bring the stars to heel, leaving terror in the hands of his regents and the fleets of his legions, the Adeptus Praetorian remained behind. They became the guardians of a realm that, though unified, still boiled with old hatreds and treacheries. Here they learned the art of vigilance in a way no frontline soldier ever could. They learned to see in the absence of movement, to hear in the absence of sound. They learned that threats to the Emperor's will were as often born from whispered words in a torchlit room as from fleets massing in a distant void. It was in these years that the nature of their loyalty began to sharpen into something colder than love and harder than faith. The Praetorian did not merely obey the Emperor, they embodied his permanence, his survival, his authority, his very right to rule. These were not questions to be weighed or debated. They were axioms upon which reality itself rested. To break their oath was to undo the world, and so they stood, century after century, a constant in an empire defined by flux and war. They were not loved, save perhaps by those too naive to understand them. They were respected, feared, and sometimes hated, even by other arms of the Imperium. Astartes' captains resented their interference in matters of planetary compliance. Rogue traders cursed their arrival at the moment when profitable arrangements were about to be sealed. Even the custodians regarded them with a mixture of disdain and wary acknowledgement, as one might regard a lesser blade still capable of killing its wielder. But none dared move against them, for the shadow of their authority stretched from the lowest underhive to the solar throne itself. Still, even stone wears under the touch of water. Over time, the Praetorian creed, loyalty without end, began to intersect with darker necessities. The Imperium is not a gentle master, and terror not a safe heart. In the vaults beneath the palace, they uncovered plots to unseat the Emperor in his absence, conspiracies that reached into the very fabric of imperial governance. Some they crushed openly, others they erased so completely that no one outside the order would ever know they had existed. In the archives of the Adeptus Praetorian, sealed to all but their highest commanders, there are said to be records of assassinations carried out in the Emperor's name against individuals whose crimes were known only to the throne. Thus the paradox of their existence began to emerge. To protect the Emperor's reign, they would sometimes act against the Emperor's subjects in ways the Emperor himself might never have sanctioned. This was not treachery in their eyes. This was duty in its purest form, the kind that requires the guardian to make choices the protected must never know about. In this they were unlike any other force in the Imperium, for even the Inquisition must justify its acts to itself. The Adeptus Praetorian need only look to the throne, and so the centuries passed, their watch unbroken, their oaths unshaken. To the people of terror, they became part of the scenery of power, unchanging, unspeaking, eternal. Yet eternity is a dangerous thing for mortals to attempt, for while the throne may endure forever, no man or woman truly can. When the day comes, as it must, when every living Praetorian falls and another takes their place, what remains of the oath they swore at the dawn of the Imperium? Does it live in the steel and gold of their armour, in the silence of their vigil, or in the hearts of those who remember the Emperor as he was? If the throne endures forever, what becomes of those sworn to guard it for eternity? The Emperor's triumph in the Unification Wars was not marked by the thunder of drums or the jubilant cry of a free people. It was marked by stillness, a hush that fell over terror when the last of its tyrants bent the knee or lay dead beneath the banners of the imperial Aquila. The continents were stitched together not merely by chains of conquest, but by arteries of governance, bureaucracy, and fear. Yet victory on the soil of old Earth was only the first step in the greater war, the war to bind humanity into one Imperium under a single unyielding hand. And for that, the Emperor knew that armies alone would not suffice. The Legiones Astartes, in their thousands, were built for expansion. The Imperial army, vast beyond reckoning, was designed to enforce the will of terror across the stars. But these were weapons that must be wielded, not guardians that could endure untended. The Emperor would not remain on terror forever. He would be the spear that pierced the galaxy. Someone, or something, would have to be the shield. Thus the Adeptus Praetorian, conceived in the crucible of war, were formally given shape in the quiet aftermath of conquest. Their elevation was no grand ceremony. There was no public declaration, no proclamation to the people of Terra. Instead, it took place in the shadowed recesses of the Imperial Palace, in a chamber whose walls bore the scars of the wars just past. There, the first High Commander of the Praetorians, known to history only as Watchmaster Primus, knelt before the Golden Throne. The Emperor spoke few words, yet they were words that would echo for millennia in the hearts of his chosen wardens. "You're not to guard my life alone, but the life of my reign." It was a coronation without crowns, an oath without witness, and yet it was one of the most consequential moments in the history of the Imperium. For in those words was implied a terrible duty, one that transcended the survival of the man who sat upon the throne. It was a charge to preserve the idea of his rule, the sanctity of his station, even if the day came when the man and the ideal no longer aligned. This was the seed of the Black Oath, though its full meaning would only be revealed in the ages to come. The early years of the Adeptus Praetorian were years of shadows and silence. Terra, though unified, still boiled with intrigue. Tech barons of the Pan-Pacific Combine whispered of reclaiming their lost dominions. Clan chiefs in the African Protectorate sought to undermine imperial appointees with tribal loyalties that had endured for centuries. In the deep hab blocks of the Pan-Eurasian hives, seditious cults dreamt of resurrecting the old dynasties crushed by the Emperor's armies. These were not threats to be met with planetary bombardment or massed infantry. They were to be met with the cold precision of the Praetorian blade. The watchword of those days was preemption. A Praetorian strike was rarely seen by the public, and its cause rarely recorded in the histories. A governor found dead in his sleep, a supply convoy to a rebel stronghold vanishing in the Himalayan passes, an entire conclave of conspirators never emerging from their subterranean meeting place. These were the marks of the throne's hidden guardians, and always, in the shadows beyond the flicker of torchlight or lumen globes, there was the faint gleam of gold armour. Even in peace, the Emperor's presence on Terra was a constant magnet for both ambition and fear. Envoys from newly compliant worlds came to swear fealty, bearing tribute in the form of relics, weapons, and oaths. Each such occasion was an opportunity for treachery, and the Praetorians were never absent. They stood at the Emperor's side in lines of perfect symmetry, their stillness more eloquent than the heralds who proclaimed the glory of the Imperium. Their armour bore no sigils save the aquila, their helms hid any trace of humanity. They were not there to impress. They were there to remind every eye in the hall that the Emperor's safety was beyond question, and that his reign was safeguarded by something as inevitable and as remorseless as the march of time itself. It was in these diplomatic theatres that the Adeptus Praetorian began to master another form of warfare, the war of perception. They understood that a presence could be a weapon sharper than any blade. A single unblinking helm turned toward a delegate could make that delegate's tongue falter mid-pledge. A measured, synchronized step forward at the moment of hesitation could collapse the resolve of an entire negotiation. The Praetorians did not speak in these moments. They did not need to. The language of their silence was fluent and absolute. Yet the Adeptus Praetorian were not merely ceremonial guards. Their remit extended to the darkest corners of the throne's reach. When the imperial truth was challenged by worlds reluctant to cast aside the old faiths, it was often a Praetorian strike team that arrived first, not to wage open war, but to decapitate resistance before it could bloom into rebellion. In the deep cold of the Saturnine moons, they dismantled a ring of rogue void ship captains whose smuggling threatened the Emperor's control of the Jovian shipyards. On the oceanic world of Theory, they eliminated the high priesthood of a sun-worshipping cult in a single night, leaving the planet leaderless and ripe for imperial assimilation. Their methods in these operations were marked by a paradoxical blend of restraint and finality. The Praetorians preferred precision over spectacle, surgical removal over mass destruction, and yet, when the situation demanded, they could unleash violence with a swiftness and intensity that rivaled even the most zealous Astartes assault. They understood that fear was a currency, and that its careful application could keep 100 worlds in line without ever firing a shot. Inside the palace, their role was no less vital. The Emperor's vision for the Imperium was vast, and the machinery required to realize it was both intricate and treacherous. High Lords of Terror, nascent administratum officials, mechanicum envoys, all moved within the palace's labyrinthine corridors, each with their own ambitions and loyalties. The Praetorians walked those corridors too, unseen yet unavoidable. They observed the subtle exchanges between ministers, the lingering glances over map tables, the sudden silences when certain names were spoken. Over years, they built a web of awareness so fine that few acts of disloyalty escaped notice. This vigilance was not without its cost. To be a Praetorian was to surrender the self entirely to the throne. Bonds of family, friendship, and even brotherhood in arms were subordinate to the oath. Should a Praetorian's kin commit treachery, the blade would fall without hesitation. Should a comrade's resolve falter, the correction would be swift and terminal. The Order's creed demanded that the Praetorians stand apart from all ties save one, the tie to the Emperor's reign. And yet, for all their detachment, they were not immune to the shaping hand of the man they served. The Emperor's mind was a forge in which not only weapons but ideals were tempered, and those who stood closest to him absorbed something of his vision. Many Praetorians came to see themselves not simply as guards of the present, but as sentinels of the future, a future in which humanity, united and unassailable, would stride among the stars unchallenged. To them, every action taken in the shadowed halls of the palace, every preemptive strike in a distant system, was a brick in the unending wall of the Imperium. But walls, once raised, can also imprison. Even in those earliest days, there were quiet voices among the High Lords who questioned whether the Praetorians' loyalty was too absolute, their authority too unaccountable. What would happen, they asked in whispered conferences, if these silent watchers ever turned their eyes inward, deciding that a change of rule was necessary to preserve the throne's sanctity? These whispers were never spoken in the presence of the Praetorians themselves, but the very fact of their existence hinted at the unease their order inspired. The Adeptus Praetorian did not seek the trust of others. Trust could be broken. They sought only obedience, for obedience could be enforced. And so, they moved through the early decades of the Imperium's expansion like the shadow of the throne itself, unseen until the moment their presence was unavoidable, inexorable in their purpose, relentless in their execution. It was in this era that they established the Eternity Bastion, their primary fortress within the palace complex, a citadel within a citadel, guarded by layered defences of adamantium and gravitic fields, its halls lined with the banners of no campaigns, the trophies of no wars. The bastion was not a monument to victory, but a machine for vigilance. Here, the oaths of new initiates were spoken in chambers lit only by the pale glow of the throne's reflected light. Here, decisions were made that could alter the fate of worlds without a single order ever leaving terror. In the years to come, the Adeptus Praetorian would face trials far greater than the scattered embers of old Earth's defiance. They would be tested by treachery within the Imperium's own heart, by wars that threatened not just the Emperor's realm but the Emperor himself. Yet even in those first quiet years after the unification, the shape of their destiny was already visible to those with eyes to see, a destiny not defined by conquest, but by the ceaseless, merciless preservation of the Emperor's reign. And somewhere, in the sealed archives of the Eternity Bastion, the words of that first oath still endure, locked away from all but the Praetorians' highest ranks, words that, if spoken aloud, might cast the entire Imperium in a new and terrible light. The Imperial Palace was not merely a building, it was a continent-spanning organism, a city and a fortress, a labyrinth of steel veins and stone bones. Within its walls, the fate of humanity was debated, decreed, and sometimes destroyed. But even a fortress of such scale required defenders who could match its permanence, guardians as immovable as its adamantine gates, as unyielding as its cyclopean walls. The Adeptus Praetorian were the answer to that need, and their bastions, both of flesh and stone, became an inseparable part of the palace's anatomy. The Eternity Bastion, their primary redoubt, was not raised for grandeur. Its foundations were driven deep into the bedrock beneath the inner palace, where the air was cold and dry, and the sound of the surface world was swallowed by the weight of stone. The halls were lined with walls of black basalt quarried from the Himalasian ranges, polished to a dull sheen that reflected no light in full. Its gates were triple-layered, a barrier of auramite lattice, a slab of adamantium thick enough to turn the impact of a titan's fist, and finally an energy shield keyed to the pulse patterns of the Watchmaster himself. None entered without sanction, none left without notice. This was the visible fortress, but the Praetorians also held dominion over spaces the rest of the Imperium never saw. Beneath the bastion ran the subsigillum vaults, a network of reinforced corridors, meditation cells, armories, and command stations, all interconnected by lifts and sealed blast doors whose activation codes were known to only a handful of living souls. It was here that new recruits underwent the final rites of initiation. It was here that the Order's most closely guarded records, mission logs, intelligence archives, and the sealed annals of the Black Oath, were kept under the watch of sentries who had not spoken aloud in decades. Recruitment into the Adeptus Praetorian was a process more akin to extraction than to enlistment. The Order did not advertise for candidates, nor did it request them from other branches of the Imperium. Instead, the Watchmaster and his council identified individuals through channels known only to them, a decorated captain of the Imperial Guard whose loyalty had been proven in a hopeless defence, a void-born sergeant whose crew had perished to the last in holding a docking ring against chaos boarding parties, even the rare aspirant to the Adeptus Custodes, whose physique or gene coding fell short of perfection, but whose resolve was unbreakable. When such a candidate was chosen, there was no ceremony. They would be approached by an unarmoured emissary of the Praetorian Order, a man or woman whose bearing alone would still a room. The offer was not couched in persuasion. It was a statement, delivered with the finality of a sentence. You have been selected to serve the throne. Acceptance was assumed. Refusal was not recorded, for it was not permitted. From that moment, the initiates ceased to exist in the records of their former life. Administratum archives would note them as dead or missing. Their personal effects would be destroyed. Family, comrades, and commanders would be given no explanation, only the cold comfort of imperial necessity. The initiate was transported under guard to the Eternity Bastion, and there they would begin the long unmaking of the self. Training was a crucible in which not only the body but the mind and will were reforged. Physical conditioning rivaled that of the Astartes neophytes, though without the benefit of gene seed enhancements. The human limits of endurance, reflex and pain tolerance were pushed to the edge and then deliberately exceeded, often through means that defied standard doctrine. Extreme vacuum acclimatization, multi-day sensory deprivation, and combat drills conducted under gravitic fields several times standard Terran gravity. But physical mastery was only the foundation. The true measure of a Praetorian was their ability to think in terms of the throne's permanence. To them, personal ambition was a liability, empathy a potential vulnerability, and hesitation a sin. Through relentless mental conditioning, they were taught to perceive threats not as events, but as trajectories, to see the consequence in the cause before the cause had even fully formed. Weapon training was exhaustive, encompassing not only conventional arms but exotic devices designed for situations the Imperium would never admit to encountering. Plasma halberds with gravitic anchors for holding defensive lines, compact las carbines tuned for lethal penetration at short range, gravitic suppression shields capable of repelling both ballistic and psychic assaults for brief but decisive moments. Each Praetorian was expected to master every weapon in the Bastion's arsenal, for any could become the decisive tool in defense of the throne. Equally important was the mastery of ceremonial function. The Adeptus Praetorian were as much a symbol as they were a force of arms, and their presence in the great halls of the palace was governed by traditions older than some imperial sectors. Drill formations were executed with absolute precision, down to the synchronized beat of armoured boots on marble floors. Posture, stance, and the precise angle of a weapon rest were matters of doctrine, for in the eyes of the Imperium's petitioners, even the smallest deviation could be read as weakness. This balance between martial utility and ceremonial rigidity shaped the Praetorians into something unlike any other arm of the Imperium. They were not as genetically perfect as the Custodians, nor as numerous as the Imperial Guard, nor as individually deadly as an Astartes in full fury. But they were constant. When the wars of expansion dragged the legions to the farthest edges of the galaxy, when the Guard bled itself dry in campaign after campaign, the Praetorians remained in their posts. They were the reminder that while worlds might burn and fleets might be lost, terror itself endured. It was perhaps inevitable that such constancy would come at a cost. The isolation of the Bastion fostered a culture apart from the rest of the Imperium, insular, self-referential, bound by a code few outsiders could grasp. Praetorians spoke little even among themselves. Their communication honed into an economy of words and gestures. They marked time not in years but in vigils, the unbroken stretches of service between the rare occasions when a guard might be rotated to another station. And yet within that insularity there existed a quiet pride. Every member of the Order knew they stood in a line unbroken since the days of the unification. Every one of them had taken the same oath in the same chamber, under the same light. In a galaxy where change was often synonymous with decay, this continuity was their armour against despair. The bastion itself mirrored that unyielding ethos. Its walls were without ornament, save for the occasional inlaid aquila or the engraved maxims of service. The corridors were designed with defence in mind, choke points where a handful of defenders could hold against hundreds, overlapping fields of fire, and hidden galleries for marksmen or psychic nullifiers. Even its training halls doubled as fortified redoubts, capable of sealing into independent kill zones should the palace ever be breached. Few outside the Order had ever seen the innermost sanctums of the Eternity Bastion. The High Lords of Terror were not admitted without invitation. The custodians had their own domains and seldom crossed into Praetorian territory. In this secrecy, the Praetorians found strength, for what was unknown could not be subverted. To stand in the bastion was to feel the weight of history pressing from every stone. The silence there was not absence but presence. The presence of those who had stood before, who had watched the throne through the turning of centuries, who had laid down their lives without witness or memorial. Every corridor was lined with memory, though few would name it as such. From this fortress of flesh and stone, the Adeptus Praetorian looked out upon a galaxy that even then was beginning to fray at its edges. The seeds of heresy had not yet bloomed, but the soil was fertile. The great expansion of the Imperium would bring both glory and peril. And when the first storms broke over the palace, it would be the men and women of the bastion who stood unmoving, a line as straight and unbroken as the walls they guarded. In time, their constancy would be tested as never before. For the walls of stone could hold against armies, but the walls of flesh would be called upon to hold against betrayal. And those walls, once breached, could never be rebuilt the same way again. The great vaults of the imperial palace whispered with the weight of centuries. Marble floors, worn smooth by the tread of generations of officials, petitioners, and warriors, stretched into shadowed distances where only the glimmer of lumen strips and the echo of bootfalls dared to intrude. Beyond these vast ceremonial halls, deeper in the arteries of terror's most secretive bastion, the Adeptus Praetorian walked their watch. To them, the echo of footsteps was no idle sound. It was the slow heartbeat of the Imperium itself, and they were sworn to guard its every pulse. By the close of the 32nd millennium, the Adeptus Praetorian had transcended mere martial guardianship. They had become an institution within an institution, a power lattice woven through the arteries of imperial governance. When the High Lords of Terror deliberated, it was often beneath the gaze of Praetorian helms, silent, expressionless visors that reflected nothing yet absorbed everything. The edicts of the Senatorum Imperialis, the quiet manoeuvrings of the Officio Assassinorum, even the veiled protocols of the Custodian Guard, all were known, in some measure, to the Praetorian command. Knowledge was a weapon, and the Adeptus Praetorian kept theirs honed sharper than any blade. This was not achieved by strength of arms alone. Their ascendance had been the result of deliberate, patient work, forging alliances with the administratum's scribes, brokering trust with the Chartist captains who ferried vital resources to Terra, and cultivating an aura of unimpeachable loyalty in the eyes of the Adeptus Arbites. Their oaths were not merely words, but bonds sealed in the blood of sacrifice, of their own, and of those who would see the Imperium falter. In the shadowy interstice between the rule of law and the rule of the throne, they thrived. The political landscape they navigated was treacherous. Every High Lord had their own ambitions. Some sought to expand their influence across the segmenti, others merely to preserve their fiefdoms against encroachment. In such a climate, the Praetorians' value was not just their martial readiness, but their role as impartial arbiters. They would enforce a High Lord's decree with the same iron precision as they would deny it, if it stood against the throne's greater stability. And yet, impartiality was never absolute. Beneath the veneer of neutrality, the Command Council of the Praetorian maintained a vision for the Imperium's endurance that sometimes required steering the currents rather than merely standing guard upon the shore. It was during this gilded period that the Praetorians' numbers reached their zenith. Tens of thousands bore their heraldry across the galaxy, stationed in the fortress spires of segmentum command hubs, aboard blackstone bastions guarding warp lanes, and in the fortified precincts of shrine worlds where the Emperor's divinity burned brightest in mortal hearts. Each detachment mirrored the rigid discipline of Terra's central garrison, ever watchful, ever prepared to enact the will of the High Lords without hesitation. The uniformity of their discipline was more than a matter of training. The Praetorian indoctrination regimen, already unrelenting, deepened into a lifetime of surveillance, self-examination, and ceremonial reaffirmation. A Praetorian recruit could expect to spend decades in silent service before even being entrusted with command of a single squad. The patience of this system weeded out the ambitious for ambition's sake, rewarding instead those whose loyalty was proven through monotony and trial alike. For the few who endured, advancement was not a ladder but a crucible. Each elevation in rank carried with it not privileges, but greater isolation from the comforts of mortal life. There were whispers, quiet, dangerous whispers, that some High Lords chafed under this watchful authority. Not because the Praetorian exceeded their mandate, but because they fulfilled it too well. Corruption found it harder to take root in halls where their helmed silhouettes stood motionless in the periphery, silent as judgment. One particularly bold Magos of the Adeptus Mechanicus, after a failed bid to divert Titan legions to his private control, remarked bitterly that the Praetorian make loyalty a weapon sharper than treachery. Yet it was precisely this rigidity, this refusal to bend to the currents of personal power, that began to sow the earliest, finest cracks in the gilded edifice. For in a galaxy where survival often demanded compromise, the Praetorians' refusal to dilute their creed set them apart, and isolation, for all its strength, breeds both envy and suspicion. Some saw them as the Emperor's perfect servants, others as the Emperor's perfect tools, ready to be turned against any who lost the trust of their masters. And it was not only within the palace walls that their influence was felt. In the far-flung corners of the Imperium, commanders of the Imperial Guard learned to expect Praetorian oversight in the aftermath of great victories and costly defeats alike, where planetary governors grew complacent or heretical. The arrival of a Praetorian detachment was often the first sign that the High Lord's patience had worn thin. On more than one occasion, a world's ruling council found themselves removed from office under the quiet shadow of a Praetorian escort, their fates sealed in chambers to which no vox record or scribe ever bore witness. The citizens of the Imperium saw in them a paradox. They were both feared and revered, their presence a symbol of safety to the loyal and a harbinger of doom to the corrupt. To the common worker on Hiveworld, the sight of Praetorian armour gleaming amid the soot and ash was a reminder that the throne still watched, even in the darkest strata of the city. To the warlord plotting rebellion in the fringes, it was the shadow at the edge of every council meeting, the unblinking gaze that could pierce even the deepest bunker. But behind the ceremonial marches, behind the iron discipline and political deftness, there was an unspoken truth that the Praetorian themselves could never ignore. They were not custodians. They were not demigods in golden armour, bound to the Emperor's person. They were mortal men and women, vulnerable to fear, doubt, and the slow erosion of conviction that even the most fervent oath could not fully forestall. In this recognition lay the seeds of future trial. For while they had risen to a place of unparalleled trust, they could never entirely escape the reality that trust in the Imperium was a currency, and currencies are spent. By the closing years of this golden vigil, a pattern had begun to emerge, subtle yet inexorable. The more they were called upon to arbitrate disputes between imperial powers, the more they were drawn into the machinery of those disputes themselves. Each intervention, however necessary, bound them more tightly to the tangled web of alliances and rivalries that composed the High Lord's world. With each thread pulled, each balance shifted, the Praetorian moved a step closer to the moment when they would no longer merely guard the Imperium's heart, but be forced to choose between preserving it as it was or reshaping it into what they believed it must become. That choice still lay in the unseen future, hidden behind decades of loyal service and unbroken vigilance. But the murmurs had begun. In the quiet of the marble halls, in the recesses of segmentum command chambers, and in the sealed vox conclaves of the Senatorum, questions were being asked, not aloud, but in the silent language of wary glances and calculated silences. Questions of loyalty, of power, and of what the Adeptus Praetorian might do if the will of the High Lords ever diverged from the will of the throne. For now the Praetorians stood untouched. their authority unchallenged, their loyalty unimpeached. Yet in the history of the Imperium, the moments before the storm are always the most still, the most deceptively golden, and in that stillness, the first, faint rumble could already be heard, far out beyond the walls of terror, where the stars burned cold and war never truly slept. Because loyalty is never tested in peace, it is tested in fire, and fire was coming. They called themselves the Emperor's Second Pulse, the quiet, unyielding heartbeat that thudded beneath the vaulted silence of the Imperial Palace. The Adeptus Praetorian did not merely stand guard, they embodied a creed forged in secrecy and tempered in eternity. Every warrior was more than flesh, more than armour, more than an oath. They were the crystallization of doctrine passed from shadowed lips to loyal ears over 10,000 years. Their culture was a fortress of the mind, built from stone quarried in the earliest days of the Imperium, when betrayal was a constant spectre and trust a currency too rare to spend. From the moment a recruit was chosen, plucked from the scholar progenium's highest ranks, or from certain regiments whose loyalty had been blood-proven, their identity ceased to exist in any civilian or military record. Names were erased, birthplaces purged, history rewritten into a single fact. They were now Praetorian. Their old loyalties, even to homeworld or family, were considered dangerous clutter. The only truth they were permitted to carry forward was that their life belonged to the Emperor and the throne, and that both could be extinguished in an instant if they failed in their duty. The structure of their order mirrored no other imperial arm. At its peak, the Adeptus Praetorian operated under a triarch command, 3 Lords Praetorian whose authority was absolute within their remit. The First Lord oversaw ceremonial presence, the arm that maintained their visible role as the Emperor's guardians, standing immovable in the halls of the palace and at the gates of imperial power. The Second Lord commanded operational integrity, directing covert deployments beyond terror to safeguard vital assets, protect High Lords in transit, or quash threats before they reached the throne world. The Third Lord ruled over doctrinal continuity, the keepers of their secret histories, trainers of the next generation, and arbiters of internal discipline. Below the Triarch, the hierarchy was brutally simple. Sentinels formed the bulk of the order, battle-tested veterans whose service in the Praetorian spanned centuries. Beneath them were initiates, the newly inducted, undergoing years of conditioning and skill refinement before being trusted with full duties. A rare and revered rank existed between Sentinel and Lord, the Eminent Guard. These were individuals so unshakable, so unflinching in their service, that their presence alone could break an enemy's will to strike. Eminent Guards were living relics, their armour adorned with only the barest of personal markings. Each line a record of centuries stood unyielding. Their technology was both archaic and peerless. The Praetorian warplate, known simply as Aegis pattern armour, was a suit of power armour engineered not for mobility like Astartes plate, nor for mass production like the carapace armour of the Arbites. Instead, it was a fortress worn upon the body, each plate layered with void-shielding nodes, adamantium lacing, and neural response servos that synchronized perfectly with the wearer after years of imprinting. The armour was as much a prison as a protection, binding the warrior's body into the exact stance, movement, and posture decreed by the Order's doctrine. Removing the armour was a ceremonial act, requiring the presence of at least one superior officer, for it was believed that without its weight, a Praetorian's mind could wander into dangerous softness. Their weaponry reflected the same philosophy, slow, deliberate, utterly final. The standard Praetorian armament was the vigilance pattern halberd, a hybrid between a power axe and a power spear, its crackling blade capable of shearing ceramite or pulverizing bone. For ranged combat, many bore God's Tongue, a compact high-yield bolt gun variant optimized for palace corridors, designed to deliver absolute stopping power at close range. Specialist squads deployed graviton mauls, displacer shields, and execution-grade plasma pistols, though such weapons were reserved for moments of unmistakable crisis. Yet it was not steel, nor ceramite that made the Adeptus Praetorian dangerous. It was doctrine. The doctrine of the closed circle was their philosophical heart. Nothing outside the circle is to be trusted, and nothing within it is to be questioned. This principle ensured absolute unity, but it also bred an inner world sealed from the rest of the Imperium. The circle's invisible walls extended even to the High Lords themselves. The Praetorian obeyed the High Lords in all matters, Yet in the silent calculus of their order, the Emperor's safety outweighed any single lord's command. This created moments of exquisite tension, where a Praetorian might refuse a direct order if it risked the throne's sanctity, knowing full well that such defiance could invite political death. Training was a crucible of mind as much as body. For years, initiates endured isolation drills. Weeks in sensory deprivation vaults, their minds fed only fragments of scripture and tactical data, until their thoughts moved only along prescribed channels. Memory editing rites were performed not through crude lobotomies, but via deep hypno-conditioning, erasing dangerous doubts while leaving tactical creativity intact. Combat drills were relentless, focused on small unit defense against overwhelming force, simulating scenarios where the Praetorian might be the only barrier between a blade and the Emperor's heart. The culture of honour within the Adeptus Praetorian was paradoxical. To outsiders they seemed mechanical, bereft of personal ambition or identity. But within the circle, bonds were forged in iron. Loyalty was measured not in words, but in duration, the years one stood beside another without faltering. There were no medals, no public commendations. The highest honour a Praetorian could receive was the standing, an unbroken 24-hour guard in the Hall of Radiance, under the direct gaze of the Golden Throne. Surviving such duty was a mark of both physical endurance and spiritual purity. This insular honour bred rivalries as much as camaraderie. The silent duels, unspoken contests between sentinels, were an open secret in the Order. No blood was spilled, no blows exchanged, yet reputations rose and fell by subtle acts of precision, timing, and readiness. A sentinel who consistently bested their rivals in these invisible games could expect swifter promotion, though never to the point of disrupting unity. Philosophically, the Praetorian viewed themselves as the Emperor's reflection in flesh. To them, the throne was not merely a machine sustaining a god, but a mirror that demanded they embody his permanence. This belief bled into their rituals. Every morning watch began with the stillness, a minute of absolute immobility before the first shift changed, a silent offering of their steadiness to the master of mankind. Every evening ended with the threefold turn, a precise rotation of stance, symbolizing vigilance in all directions, past, present, and the shadowed future. It was this combination of relentless doctrine, impermeable culture, and absolute focus that made the Adeptus Praetorian both revered and feared. The common citizen might think of them as ceremonial guards, but the enemies of the Imperium and the few traitors who had faced them in the darkened halls of power knew better. They were the still blade in the scabbard, the watch that never ended, the line that would not break. And yet, such perfect rigidity had its price. For an order so walled within itself, any corruption that breached those walls would spread unseen, unchallenged. In the centuries to come, that flaw would prove not merely dangerous but catastrophic. For the Adeptus Praetorian, who had built themselves into the unyielding bulwark of the throne, had never truly prepared for the day when the shadow would rise from within. The Adeptus Praetorian had always been forged in the crucible of loyalty, their oath sworn not merely to the Imperium's laws, but to the Emperor's very dream of human unity. For centuries this creed had been unassailable. Yet history, like stone under the slow drip of water, does not shatter in an instant. It erodes. And it was in the silent halls of terror's most hallowed chambers that the first hairline fractures began to show, imperceptible to all but those who knew exactly where to look. The High Lords of Terror had long regarded the Praetorian as incorruptible, a sentinel force immune to the petty intrigues and power plays that poisoned so many imperial bodies. But with that immunity came a dangerous complacency. Few dared question their methods, and fewer still were permitted to witness the machinery of their operations. Such isolation breeds not merely secrecy, but the slow birth of agendas that, while cloaked in duty, begin to diverge from the central will they were sworn to protect. It began with whispers, reports from segmentum commanders that the Praetorian had gone beyond their assigned remit, removing planetary governors without High Lord sanction, confiscating tithe shipments deemed improper, altering regimental deployments to prevent what they called future instability. In isolation, each act could be justified. Combined, they formed a pattern, an invisible hand shaping the Imperium according to designs known only to themselves. Inside the Praetorian fortress monastery on Terra, the walls themselves seemed to absorb the tension. The Hall of Ever Vigilant was no longer a mere gallery of honour, but a place of closed-door councils where the most senior Castellans debated whether their duty was to follow the orders of the High Lords or to anticipate them. That one word, anticipate, became the quiet fulcrum of a philosophical divide. To anticipate meant to act before sanction. To act before sanction meant in practice to rule, and rulership, however temporary or justified, was a seed from which treason could sprout. Yet those who argued for restraint were met with grim realities. The Imperium was vast beyond imagining. Communication delays between Terra and the far-flung sectors were measured not in hours, but in years. What good was the Emperor's will if it arrived a decade too late to prevent catastrophe? Was it not the Praetorian's sacred duty to fill that void, to ensure the stability of the Emperor's realm in the gaps between decree and execution? It was in the Calyx Expanse that this philosophical schism first turned bloody. The governor of Juno Prime, a man whose corruption had metastasized into open rebellion, was to be removed. The High Lords had sent orders to rally nearby Astra Militarum forces, surround the planetary capital, and detain him alive for judgment. But the Praetorian Castellan assigned to the sector, a battle-hardened veteran named Othmar Valen, saw the risk of delay. He deployed his own strike cohort, bypassed the guard entirely, and executed the governor in his palace before the High Lord's order had even crossed the warp. On Juno Prime, the people hailed the Praetorian as saviours. On Terra, the act was recorded with quiet unease. The High Lords issued no public rebuke. Valen's results were undeniable, but behind closed doors, a precedent had been set. Orders from Terra were no longer the only voice that mattered. What made the situation even more dangerous was that the Praetorian themselves did not recognise the peril. To them, these interventions were acts of mercy, acts of efficiency. They were saving lives, preserving imperial stability, and fulfilling the Emperor's dream more swiftly than the bureaucrats of the Senatorum Imperialis ever could. But in the marble corridors of power, every act of independent authority diminishes the weight of central command. The Adeptus Arbits, guardians of imperial law, began to file quiet complaints. The Officio Medici noted that certain politically unstable planets were suddenly cleared of problematic leaders mere weeks before Arbit's investigations could begin. The Departamento Munitorum noticed tithe shipments being reallocated to war zones without their consent. None of these acts were unlawful, not exactly, but each chipped away at the lattice of imperial governance. It was then that the first rumours surfaced of a hidden archive deep within the Praetorian stronghold on Terra, a chamber said to contain a living map of the Imperium, marked not with its worlds and resources, but with predictions. Predictions of collapse, rebellion, secession, heresy. The map was said to shift daily, updated by a silent order within the Praetorian called the Prognosticars. Whether this was myth or truth, none outside the order could say. But if it was true, then the Praetorian were no longer merely defending the Imperium as it was, they were shaping what it would become. The Adeptus Mechanicus took notice. Their priests had long cooperated with the Praetorian, providing the rarest arms and armour, but now Magos from Mars began sending technical observers to ensure no forbidden data systems were in use. The Praetorian allowed them entry, but only into certain halls, never into the Vault of Anticipation, if indeed such a place existed. And yet, even as suspicion grew in the halls of Terra, war swept across the eastern fringe. Tyrannid splinter fleets descended upon the vulnerable Sunda Reach, and imperial defences crumbled. It was here that the Praetorian proved once again why they were indispensable. With the High Lords paralysed by debate over resource allocation, the Praetorian mobilised 5 cohorts, intercepting the Xenos advance and holding the line for 3 brutal years until reinforcements arrived. Millions of imperial lives were saved. Worlds that would have been consumed still bore the Aquila in their skies. This victory silenced many critics, but it also deepened the paradox. The Praetorians' independence was dangerous, but their independence had saved the Imperium yet again. Could such a blade ever be sheathed without dulling it? Or was the greater danger in letting it swing freely? Within their own ranks, a subtler danger grew. Younger officers, forged in this new era of decisive autonomy, began to see themselves not merely as servants of the Imperium, but as its architects. Veterans who had served in the old deferential way were sidelined, retired, or sent to quiet backwater posts. Castellan Valin himself became a hero figure among these younger warriors, a symbol of what the Praetorian should be. The Imperium's will made flesh, unsullied by politics. But in the warp's echoing corridors, whispers carried a different truth. The ruin of many imperial institutions began as a single truth, elevated above all others until it became dogma. The Praetorians' creed was shifting, subtly but inexorably, from loyalty to the Emperor's Imperium to loyalty to their vision of it. And so, in the shadowed heart of the throne world, a question began to pulse like a quiet heartbeat. When the day came that the Emperor's will and the Praetorians' judgment diverged, which would they choose? The answer, when it came, would change the Imperium forever. They had endured the attrition of centuries, the ebb and flow of imperial will, the attritional wars against the Xenos beyond the halo stars and the treacheries within the Imperium's own borders. Yet for all their discipline, for all their loyalty wrought into the marrow of their bones, the Adeptus Praetorian could not forever resist the slow pressure of fracture. The seeds of this breaking had been sown long before the first blade was drawn in rebellion, buried in doctrine, in the absolute nature of their charge, and in the unbending rigidity that made them what they were. In the dying years of the 37th millennium, the High Lords of Terror issued a decree that would set the Adeptus Praetorian upon a path of impossible choices. The Segmentum Solar was facing not one, but three separate existential crises: a tyrannid tendril pushing inward from the galactic north, a sudden eruption of Orc Warhol along the belt of iron, and an unexpected resurgent chaos fleet striking from the Eye of Terror. The Imperial Guard was stretched beyond breaking. The Imperial Navy bled ships in every theatre. The High Lords, in desperation, issued the Lex Concordatum, a direct writ commanding the redistribution of elite forces to failing fronts, regardless of oaths, postings, or established sacred duties. For most imperial arms, such orders were absolute, but the Adeptus Praetorian had been founded with a charter older and more absolute than even the current High Lords. Their sworn duty was the protection of the throne world's immediate bastions and the sanctity of the imperial palace itself. To strip forces from those perimeters to fight wars light years away was anathema, and yet, to refuse a direct writ from the Senatorum Imperialis was, in the eyes of many, tantamount to treason. The chapter masters of the Praetorian gathered in the black hall of the Auric Bastion, a chamber untouched since the age of apostasy. The walls glimmered with banners older than most imperial worlds, their cloth stiff with centuries of dust and incense ash. There, behind sealed adamantium doors, the debate raged for 3 days without cessation. The younger commanders, blood still hot from recent campaigns, argued for compliance, seeing in the writ a test of the Praetorians' adaptability and the Emperor's will beyond Terror's horizon. The old guard, their eyes like burnished iron, saw in the order nothing but the first stone removed from the wall, the breach through which all manner of decay would follow. In the end, the decision fractured them. Half the Praetorians' outer chapters obeyed the Lex Concordatum, embarking upon distant crusades in the name of imperial unity. The others remained, citing the immutable letter of their founding oath. No formal schism was declared, no open violence broke out between the divided factions, but the rift was there, a hairline crack running down the length of the Praetorian spear, and hairline cracks given time and pressure always widen. Those who left fought with unmatched courage, their campaigns marked by precision strikes that broke sieges and shattered Xenos vanguards. On the Tyrannid front, Praetorian boarding teams gutted bioships in silent, brutal void combat. Against the Orcs, they dismantled warlord command structures before the Greenskin Tide could properly organize. In the Eye of Terror's shadow, they fought alongside the Grey Knights in purges whispered of only in the deepest vaults of the Inquisition, and yet in their absence Terror itself felt the strain. The Auric Bastion's outer rings were manned by fewer sentinels. Patrol fleets along the Martian expanse reported increased probing from unknown vessels. Most troubling of all, there were incidents, small, quickly contained but undeniable, of infiltration attempts into the lesser palace districts. The Adeptus Custodes, long allies and silent co-guardians, did not voice public reproach, but their private communiques carried a weight of disapproval that was impossible to ignore. The Adeptus Praetorian who had remained began to harden, their philosophy growing ever more insular. They spoke less of the Imperium as a whole, more of Terra alone, as if the rest of the galaxy were an inevitable entropy that must be kept at bay by a single wall of gold and adamantium. They drilled with fanatic intensity, their recruitment becoming even more selective, their initiations designed to burn away any instinct but obedience to the immediate charge. This was not evolution, it was entrenchment. The rift between the deployed and the entrenched widened further when the returning detachments brought back not just glory, but ideas. They had seen the far reaches of the Emperor's domain. They had fought for agri-worlds whose grain fed billions, for forge worlds whose production sustained entire segmentum fleets. To them, Terra was the heart, but not the totality, of the Imperium's body. They began to advocate for a more flexible charter, one that would allow the Praetorian to operate as a mobile rapid response force, in addition to their static defence. The entrenched saw this as heresy in all but name. Flexibility was weakness. A spear that was not braced in the shield wall was a spear waiting to be broken. The philosophical dispute soon took on operational consequences. Joint drills were cancelled, intelligence-sharing protocols between the two wings of the Praetorian were quietly dissolved. When a Praetorian fleet returning from the Orc front requested safe harbour in one of Terra's outer orbital bastions, they were kept waiting for 72 hours under the pretext of security clearance review. Old comrades began to greet each other with formality instead of familiarity. And in the shadows, those who preyed upon Imperial weakness began to notice. The Drukhari were the first to exploit the fissure, launching lightning raids on supply convoys intended for the returning fleets. Then came the agents of the ruinous powers, seeding suspicion with whispers. Each side of the divide fed rumours of the other's corruption. The most devastating blow came not from Xenos or Traitor, but from within the Imperium's own machinery. The Officio Assassinorum, acting on intelligence that one Praetorian commander in the entrenched faction had fallen under the sway of a forbidden Terran cult, deployed a Vindicare operative into the Auric Bastion itself. The kill was clean, efficient, and unannounced. When the entrenched Praetorians discovered the assassination, they saw only a violation of sovereignty and a message that even their unshakable bastions could be pierced. The cycle of mistrust deepened until the Praetorian spear was no longer a single weapon, but 2 points held apart by their own inertia. To outsiders they still appeared united, still gold-armoured, still unyielding, still the shield before the throne, but the fracture was there, and like all fractures in the age of the Imperium, it would not remain dormant forever. For in the darkness beyond the segmentum solar, a war was coming, one so vast, so consuming, that the Praetorian would either heal or break beyond repair, and when it came, it would not wait for them to decide. The calm before the storm is always a deception. On Terra, the gilded city of the Emperor's Majesty, the halls of power still echoed with the measured footsteps of the Adeptus Praetorian. Their armour gleamed like the last remnant of an unyielding promise. But far beyond the comfort of the palace's shadow, the Imperium's wounds festered. The fractures within the Praetorian order, once subtle as cracks in ancient marble, were about to be shattered into chasms. It began with the heralds of chaos, agents not of mere mortal rebellion but emissaries of ruin itself. In the Vale of the Noctis, a cluster of forge worlds responsible for critical arms production, cultists of the Dark Mechanicum rose from the subterranean forges with heretical engines and demon-infused weapons. The Adeptus Mechanicus responded with brutal purges, but the Praetorian detachments assigned to these worlds found themselves stretched thin, divided between loyalty to Terra and urgency to respond. Simultaneously, a shadow fleet of Necron tomb ships emerged in the Maelstrom Zone, slashing warp routes essential for segmentum communication. Entire convoys vanished without trace, and the flow of reinforcements faltered. The Adeptus Praetorian dispatched rapid response cohorts, but without the full support of the Imperial Navy's void fleets, their efforts were valiant but piecemeal. This strategic paralysis exposed the deeper fault lines in their order. The returning detachments from the segmentum's distant wars had become hardened but fractured warriors, carrying with them not only tales of victory but seeds of dissent. The ideal of an unyielding bulwark protecting the throne had become a contentious concept. For some, the Praetorian were the living shield. For others, they had become the architects of a new, ruthless order, one that dictated who would live and who would die by judgment made in secret. As crises multiplied, the Adeptus Praetorian found themselves under the most grievous test of all, the breaking storm of civil discord within their own ranks. On the eve of the Calixus Sector Rebellion, a significant contingent of Praetorian forces stationed on the agri-world Vostria refused to act against the insurgents. The faction there, loyal to the entrenched Praetorian command, viewed the rebellion as a symptom of imperial decay rather than an immediate threat. Instead of suppression, they sought negotiation, hoping to contain rather than destroy. This unprecedented hesitation shattered centuries of precedent. The High Lords of Terror reacted swiftly, branding the dissenters as traitors. The other Praetorian forces, loyal to the mobile command faction, were ordered to subdue their renegade brethren. A civil conflict among the Emperor's own protectors, unthinkable yet now unavoidable, had begun. Battles raged within the confines of space stations orbiting Vostria, in the narrow corridors of fortress monasteries, and across the ruined cities of the rebellion. Each clash was a bitter mixture of brother fighting brother, honour battling ideology, and loyalty torn between conflicting oaths. The Adeptus Custodes, called upon reluctantly, sought to mediate but found their influence limited against such a fracture. Behind these skirmishes lay the deeper question. What was the Adeptus Praetorian's ultimate purpose? Were they guardians of the Emperor's ideal, or enforcers of their own vision of an order? This question tore the order asunder and left scars on every soul who bore the golden helm. Meanwhile, the enemies of mankind watched with cruel amusement. The Dark Mechanicum cultists exploited Praetorian infighting to seize control of the Noctis forges, turning sacred manufactories into hellish foundries. The Necron tomb ships rampaged further into Imperial space, encountering ever less coordinated resistance. Even the forces of chaos probed the weaknesses revealed by the Praetorian civil war, pushing cults and demon incursions into core worlds with terrifying success. The warp itself seemed to scream, a maddening chorus reflecting the Imperium's fractured spirit. Psychers reported visions of a fractured spear, shattering the Emperor's defence. Whispered prophecies spoke of a time when the Guardians would become the greatest threat. Amidst this maelstrom, a secret council convened deep within the Auric Bastion. Lords Praetorian, once united, now argued fiercely over the future. Some urged a return to the old creed, a reconstitution of absolute loyalty and discipline. Others argued that the Imperium's survival depended on a new order, one where the Praetorian would act decisively as arbiters and executors of harsh judgment without waiting for fractured bureaucracies. The night of the final council passed with no resolution. The Praetorian were torn between duty and conviction, tradition and necessity, loyalty and power. And when dawn broke over Terra, the order that had once been the unshakable shield of the Emperor had become a fractured spear, its shards poised to either mend the Imperium or shatter it forever. The day the Adeptus Praetorian shattered was not heralded by fanfare nor recorded in triumphal texts. It came quietly, like a blade sliding slowly through silk, until the silk tore with a final irrevocable rip. Terra, the heart of the Imperium, stood as witness to the breaking of its most loyal guardians. The Praetorian, once the unyielding shield of the Emperor's realm, became the catalyst for a crisis that would echo through the stars for centuries. The rupture began in the shadow of the Calixis sector's smouldering rebellions. The mobile factions of the Praetorian had pushed hard to suppress insurgencies, their blades swift and merciless. The entrenched factions, still ensconced within the Auric Bastion and other bastions on Terra, denounced these brutal measures as short-sighted, warning that excessive force would only breed further rebellion. This clash of ideologies had long simmered beneath the surface, but now it boiled over. In a final act of defiance, the entrenched Lords Praetorian ordered the seizure of the mobile faction's command posts within the Imperial Palace. The operation was swift and devastating. Dozens of the Emperor's finest fell not to Xenos or Heretic, but to their own kind. Soldiers who had once stood shoulder to shoulder in the Emperor's name. The corridors of power ran red with blood, the golden armour of the Praetorian tarnished by the smoke of betrayal. The High Lords of Terror, shocked and enraged, condemned the entrenched factions as traitors and traitors alone. The Adeptus Custodes, long wary but reluctant to interfere, were finally deployed in force to purge the palace of the dissenters. The Custodes' intervention was decisive, their legendary blades and speed overwhelming the Praetorian resistance. Yet even as the entrenched factions fell, the order as a whole was irrevocably broken. The battle revealed deep fractures within the Praetorians' command, fractured loyalties, fragmented chains of command, and a fractured philosophy that had allowed such internal war to ignite. Many sentinels, who had fought with unyielding loyalty to the Emperor, found themselves questioning the cost of their service. What was loyalty when it led to the slaughter of one's own brothers? What was honour when it meant destruction from within? Beyond the palace walls, the Imperium itself trembled. News of the Praetorian civil war spread through the corridors of power like wildfire. Worlds teetering on the edge of rebellion saw the faltering of the Emperor's shield as an opportunity. Cults of chaos flared with renewed ferocity. Xenos raiders pushed deeper into Imperial space, emboldened by the internal discord. The Adeptus Mechanicus found their communications disrupted and their forges attacked, the Dark Mechanicum cultists exploiting the chaos with terrifying precision. In response, the High Lords enacted emergency measures to reassert control. They expanded the remit of the Adeptus Arbits, empowering them to root out Praetorian sympathizers and collaborators. In some sectors, entire Praetorian contingents were disbanded or absorbed into other Imperial forces. Yet the wound inflicted was deep and slow to heal. The Praetorian's name, once synonymous with honour and loyalty, became a whispered cautionary tale in the corridors of terror. Within the remnants of the Order, a new faction began to rise, those who sought to reclaim the Praetorians' ancient purpose by forging a new path, one that embraced both discipline and adaptability, loyalty and judgment. They called themselves the Custodes Praetoriani, a symbolic union of the eternal guardianship of the Custodes and the relentless vigilance of the Praetorian. This movement was small but determined, seeking to prevent the total dissolution of the Praetorian legacy. But even as this flicker of renewal glimmered, the shadow of the breaking lingered. The Praetorian had become a mirror of the Imperium's greatest contradictions, unwavering loyalty fractured by internal dissent, noble ideals stained by the blood of betrayal, an eternal shield cracked by its own weight. Philosophers within the Order began to question the nature of loyalty itself. Was loyalty to a throne a static, unchanging ideal? Or was it a living thing, requiring constant re-evaluation in the face of shifting realities? These questions, once whispered only in secret conclaves, became louder and more dangerous. As the Imperium braced for the conflicts that would follow, the Adeptus Praetorian's legacy hung in the balance. Their shield was shattered, but in the shards lay the possibility of rebirth or total annihilation. The Emperor's watchers had failed in their trial. The question remained, would they rise again, or be lost to history as the fallen guardians of a lost age? The answer would be written in the blood of the battles yet to come. The aftermath of the Praetorian schism was a silence heavy with mourning, a silence that stretched across the vastness of terror and echoed through the hallowed chambers of the Imperial Palace. The once golden armour of the Adeptus Praetorian was now dulled by the soot of civil war, their banners tattered by betrayal's bitter wind. What remained was not merely an order fractured by internal conflict, but a symbol cleaved in two, a warning to the Imperium of the cost of unwavering loyalty untempered by humility. In the months that followed, the High Lords of Terror moved swiftly to reforge the defences of the throne world. New regiments were raised, alliances with the Adeptus Custodes deepened, and the Adeptus Arbits were granted unprecedented authority to root out dissent. But none could replace the Praetorian, not truly. The Order had been more than soldiers. It had been the living embodiment of the Emperor's will made flesh, the eternal sentinels standing unyielding at the heart of the Imperium. The shattered remnants of the Praetorian retreated into the shadows, their numbers diminished but not extinguished. Some scattered across the segmentum solar, serving in obscure posts where their presence was barely acknowledged. Others withdrew entirely from the eyes of the Imperium, disappearing into secret enclaves where their oaths bound them still to the Emperor and the throne, even as the world above turned without them. Yet the legacy of the Praetorian did not die. From the ashes arose new orders and movements inspired by their ideals. The Custodes Praetoriani, a small but resolute faction, sought to reclaim the ancient balance. Vigilance without fanaticism, loyalty without dogma. Their numbers were few, but their purpose clear, to stand once again as the bulwark between the Emperor and the shadows that sought his throne. Philosophers and historians debated long into the dark nights of the 41st millennium, Was the downfall of the Praetorian a failure of discipline, or an inevitable consequence of the Imperium's sprawling, fractured nature? Had their rigid doctrine been too brittle to survive the tides of change, or had their greatest sin been an excess of loyalty, a loyalty so absolute that it demanded judgment, even against those they once called brothers? The consequences rippled beyond terror. Worlds that had once relied on the Praetorian for protection found themselves vulnerable to insidious threats. The Dark Mechanicum cults gained footholds in forgotten manufactorums, while Xenos raiders probed deeper into the Segmentum Solar's borders. Chaos cults whispered promises of salvation amid the decay, their poison spreading where the Praetorian's shield had faltered. But even in the darkest corners, hope endured. New heroes rose, inspired by the memory of the golden-armoured sentinels who had stood unyielding through the ages. The Adeptus Sororitas expanded their roles as protectors of imperial sanctity. The Grey Knights intensified their war against the unseen horrors of the warp. The Custodes themselves renewed their vigilance, wary of any who might seek to fill the void left by the Praetorian's fall. The Emperor's vision remained, an eternal Imperium united under his will, but it was a vision scarred by the lessons of the past. The Praetorian story became a sombre refrain, a reminder that even the mightiest shields can fracture, and that loyalty, however pure, must be tempered by wisdom and adaptability. And so the echo of the Golden Shield endures, not as a triumphant banner, but as a solemn warning. The price of vigilance is eternal, the cost of loyalty is sacrifice, and the burden of guarding the Emperor's dream is a weight heavier than adamantium. The Adeptus Praetorian may have fallen, but their watch is not yet ended.